halfway through 2023. That is insane for me to say that, but we only have about 6 months left of movies for the year. So in today's video, we're going to be diving into my top 10 favorite films so far for this year. Again, these are my favorite 10 films that I've watched in 2023. You might disagree. You might think some of these movies are terrible. You might go as far as say that, Zach, you're insane. And that's okay, because I might think that your ranking list that you leave down below is also insane. So make sure to leave your thoughts down below, because I definitely want to see what your top 10 is and start comparing. Maybe there are some films that I have missed and I need to catch up before the end of the year. And with that said, if you do want to see every film that I've watched, you can go follow me on Letterboxd. You can find that link down below in the description. But without further ado, let's get into this. Coming down at my number 10 is Scream 6. Scream 6 is still in my top 10 favorite films of this year. I found this to be a perfect Scream film in a lot of different ways, and specifically the way that it elevated the Scream franchise. I wanted grit, I wanted gore, I wanted blood, and I wanted entertainment. And for the Scream franchise, I have loved almost every single one of the movies besides Scream 3. And I found that Scream 6, while after sitting on the twist, I did find it a little bit obvious and a little bit cliche, I still really love everything that kind of goes into that. And just the way that those characters just amped it up into such a cheeky and cheesy way, but it just works for me. I also love a lot of the different sequences that they play out throughout this film within Ghostface, and I really love how they elevated Melissa and Jenna Ortega's characters. And for me, this was the film that finally made that core four stick out to me and go, yes, they can lead the Scream franchise. And I love specifically, again, what they do with Melissa's character. Wait to see what they do with her character Sam in the future. Specifically, I'm sure they're probably going to do a Scream 7 at this point. And now my number 9 is a movie that sadly bombed, and that is The Flash. The Flash for me is about everything that I could have wanted this movie to be. There's some things that hold it back. It's not a perfect movie, but I do love this movie. And I say that with someone who did love The Flash growing up. I loved Barry Allen. I loved Wally West. I loved watching the Justice League and the Justice League Unlimited show. I loved playing as him in Injustice 1 and 2. That was my main character that I played as. And I always loved reading the comic books. And for me, The Flash has always been a character that I could personally feel for. And a lot of that was when growing up, the only superpower I ever wanted was super speed. And a lot of that was because I was in cross country and track, and I would always run, and I always wanted to be the best that I possibly could be. And I was pretty decent. I'm not going to lie. I had some good PRs. For people who don't know, PRs are personal records. But The Flash, I had a lot of nostalgia going into this movie, and a lot of that hit. And the movie actually surprised me with how much of an emotional core it had. I expected a lot of nostalgia, I expected a lot of action, and I expected the universe to be reset. And it was for the most part. But when it came down to the actual emotional part of it, and specifically a final sequence between Barry and his mother, that is when the film actually won me over fully. And I went, okay, this went from being an entertaining movie to a very emotional film. And whatever you may say about Ezra Miller, I don't know what to believe at this point. I don't know what to see. There's certain things that feel real. There's certain things that don't. I don't want to get into that. But they are great in this film. They are excellent. Michael Keaton as Batman returning, excellent. He's so badass. I loved what Andy Muschietti did with the direction in there. And Sasha Calle as Supergirl. I'm a little sad we didn't get to see more of her, but I really did love what we got from her, and I can't wait, and hopefully, that she is the Supergirl for the DC universe going forward. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to completely just strip everything away and reset completely now. But for me, this movie really worked in a lot of different ways. The humor, the action, and specifically the emotion. Really much the only few things that actually do hold this film back is the visual effects. I understand that Andy Muschietti has said that they are on purpose to look like that. I can understand some of that, like within the Speed Force, but everything else, no, it's not there, man. My number 8 is Air, Ben Affleck's brand new directed film, and I absolutely loved Air. I actually just got done rewatching this for a second time and showed off my fiance and my soon-to-be mother-in-law, and they both loved it. Specifically, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, who this isn't her cup of tea usual for music, but she loved all of the beats of that time period, as well as just this story of one man trying to get signing Michael Jordan to Nike. And I love the whole journey that Matt Damon goes on throughout this movie. I love this eccentric side cast of characters. Ben Affleck, I think, might have given one of my favorite side performances in this film. I just love how he plays Knight in here. I love Jason Bateman. Viola Davis is just always excellent. But the whole way that I think this film works is specifically in the editing. The editing of this movie moves this movie along like such a brisk pace that every single sequence, every single moment feels important. And at the very last second, like by the time you notice it, you're like, holy shit, we are almost done with this movie. And it's a very breezy movie that is highly rewatchable, highly entertaining, and in a way kind of motivating. It's motivating even though it's not shocking because we know the outcome of the film. It's just very entertaining to see how they got to that outcome. And now my number 7 is Joyride. Now, a lot of you guys actually may have not seen this film yet. It doesn't premiere until early July. I highly recommend it. If you do not see this in theaters and you love our hard R, raunchy R-rated comedies, then you are absolutely missing out, and I will not forgive you if this film bombs. But it is Joyride. Joyride is one of my favorite things that I've seen this year, and for me, it'll most likely come down to be my favorite comedy of this year. This was a 5 out of 5 in my eyes, and while it is short, it is sweet. Every single joke lands for me. Now, that might not land for you because film is subjective, like I mentioned, and comedy and horror are two of the most subjective genres in the space. And I've talked to some people who didn't think Joyride was funny. I've talked to other people who absolutely agreed with me. Every single joke lands for me, and I really love the cast in here, specifically Stephanie Hsu, Ashley Park, Nicola, and Sabrina Wu. These 4 girls absolutely make this trip such a fun time, and at the same time, a very hilarious one. But at the center of this film is an actual emotional depth about finding out where you are and who your real parents are. And for me, that is something that I love to see Ashley Park's character discover, and specifically how the other characters kind of already found their own light. She's the only one with a different background. But with that, I mean, there's so many great comedic moments. I think for me, one of my favorite ones was particularly when they're on a train and drugs come into play. But the way that the drugs come into play later on in the story, the reason that I really love this comedy, because it just builds and builds and builds, and you think, okay, this is hilarious what they're doing here, but the outcome of it later on is the more extreme measuring thing, which leads into one of the best edited comedy sequences of this year. Edited comedy sequence very much heavily reminded me of Sausage Party in a way. Not saying that it gets anything weird like that, but it was very greatly done, and I love Joyride. I cannot recommend this film enough. Absolutely go see it. Now, my number 6 is Talk to Me, another film that's actually not premiering till later in July, but I did get to see this back in January. This is directed by the Raka Raka brothers, who you might have known from, of course, their YouTube channel. Maybe you've never even heard of that, but they made a movie. It premiered at Sundance. I freaking love this movie, and then A24 bought it. And I've absolutely loved seeing that they are actually blowing up. They are growing up. And now they're doing a Street Fighter film, which is great. That has nothing to do with Talk to Me. I just love talking about them. But Talk to Me is such a uniquely concepted horror film. And if you've watched their YouTube videos, you would expect something like that from them. But I expected this. Gore fest, slasher type thing, all that stuff. And when Talk to Me started, I'm like, oh yeah, this is gory. Like, they're going for it. But what I actually found in this movie was, yeah, it's gory. Yeah, it can be pretty bloody. The prosthetics are awesome. The demons look creepy. But in the end of the day, this film actually works because it's a psychological horror film, which is a slow burn at times. It's not going to be for everybody. I didn't think this film was particularly scary, but it did have scary moments. I just thought it was a freaking blast. And I loved following along this character. And the whole concept of it is, imagine high schoolers getting, their fix. Instead of doing drugs or drinking, they find a possessed arm that when they hold it and say, "Talk to me," they become possessed. And, if they take the arm away, then that goes away. But that's their fix. That's their drug fix that they get. And everything within there, it's just insane. And I found myself honestly just loving this film from top to bottom. Michael and Danny absolutely deserve a lot of credit, specifically within what they did in the directing department. But also what makes this film is the performances like Sophia Wilde and Joe Bird and Miranda Otto and Alexandra Jensen and Otis Dajani. I mean, the whole cast is great, but Sophia Wilde, for me, this is like an all-star performance right there that when I watch this, I'm like, this is the film. If this film blows up, she will blow up. And I really hope A24 really supports this thing in the theaters because I think it absolutely deserves a spot in this summer. Before we get to my top 5, I do want to mention some honorable mentions, of course, which is of the likes of Beau is Afraid. That film really worked for me. It was weird. It was wacky. I love audacious things like that. Rye Lane, which is currently on Hulu, which was for a while my favorite film of the year. Sometimes I Think About Dying is a movie that has not come out publicly yet, but it was at Sundance and I loved it. Daisy Ridley is excellent in there. Fair Play is a film that's actually coming to Netflix, I assume, later this year. It's a great movie. Elemental, it's a great return for Pixar, and I was surprised by how much I love that movie. And last but not least, I'll just mention Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. This is one of my comfort movies of this year, just like how the directors originally did Game Night. That was such a fun movie. I loved Dungeons and Dragons. Number 5, and before I say this, I want you to understand that I highly understand that I'm going to be in the minority on this movie. I don't understand why, to be honest, but I get it. I get it. I love this franchise. I am biased towards it, and this movie gave me exactly what I wanted for the film, and that is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Now, for people who don't know, Indiana Jones is my favorite movie character of all time. Pure and pure out, I love Indiana Jones. I love Harrison Ford. I grew up with him playing Indiana Jones, and the Dial of Destiny is a movie that there was a lot of buzz going into there. I love the trailers. I love the look of it. I loved that the Logan director was going to be doing this, James Mangold. I loved the cast that we were getting in here. But then their early reactions at Cannes came out. And it worried me a bit. I was like, ooh, maybe I really won't like this. Because I am one of the people that obviously love the first 3 movies. But I also really like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Like, I think that film actually grew. There's a lot of dumb shit in there. Don't get me wrong. But I actually don't mind the dumb shit in there. I like how weird and unique a lot of these Indiana Jones films gets, primarily in the 3rd act when it kind of has this like supernatural twist in some ways. And sometimes it goes a little bit above and beyond, and sometimes it goes even more above and beyond, like the aliens in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. But maybe I just invowed any opinion that I had, but I love this entire franchise. 2, 3, and 4 are like interchangeable for me at the time before seeing this movie on how I felt about them. The first one is one of my favorite films of all time, and I didn't expect for this movie to be one of my favorites of all time. But what I expected was a good Indiana Jones adventure, but I was hoping for a little bit more story to it. I was hoping for a little bit more of where's Indy in his life right now. And I say that because after rewatching all the Indiana Jones films, there is one thing that you can definitely say about those. There's not a lot of emotional depth in those movies. There's emotional moments. There is character development for Indy primarily. But I actually think watching Dial of Destiny and then looking back at the entire franchise, it really enhances this character to a certain degree. Strictly talking about Harrison Ford in here, because first off, his performance is absolutely incredible in here, but second off, it's discussing a character who's filled with regret. He's filled with issues in his life. He's filled with, he's retiring now in this film. Where is his next step? Will he be remembered? And he's alone. And seeing how they played out with that, whether it was through some certain jokes that Indy makes about himself, which I loved, or it's played out with him actually having conversations with Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character, who at first I didn't really love, but by the end of the movie, I was like, okay, I understand what this character is going for. I like her a little bit more, and I suspect on a rewatch, I will probably like her a little bit more as well from the start, because I'll kind of know what her endgame is for that. But Dial of Destiny was everything that I wanted it to be. It gave me that somber story that I think James Mangold is really good at, and I think what he did for Logan, Wolverine perhaps, he does for Indy in this film. This is a great finale for Harrison Ford. I really love where this film goes in the 3rd act. That's not going to work for everybody, because when I do talk to people, that seems to be the kind of the big turning point, that they either loved it or hated it. And the intro sequence is classic Indiana Jones. It is excellent. Even though the de-aging's a little wonky, it is amazing. And John Williams' score is, of course, great. I just, there's a lot of biasness on this film. I understand it, but this was everything I wanted and more. And I really love the depth that James Mangold decided to place for Indy in here. And a lot of people have been complaining about the action sequences. I thought they were fun. I didn't find them dull at all. My number 4 is Past Lives. This is point blank a masterpiece. Past Lives is one of the best films I've seen of this year. And the fact that I'm saying this at my number 4 and it's not even higher, yeah, I might be crazy. But Past Lives, I don't even really know what to say. I did a whole video on this one, and I think you should go watch it because that was like my initial review walking out of the theater, and I really went in depth with talking about the director and the characters, and specifically how this romance spans so many decades, but the way that it tells its story within the long distance and the way that reuniting can kind of bring that feeling back, but you really not knowing what your path is to life. And I really loved what Celine Song's directorial debut was in here for. And I think this is one of those movies that when you go and watch it, you're going to be like, wow, this is a very special film. And in a way, this is a romance. Even though it's, you know, a one that spans over decades, it's one for the ages. It will absolutely break your heart, but it'll bring it back together. And I think what Celine Song does here so well is she explores the likes of regret, fate, love, and the feelings that might bring you to tears due to certain things in your past. At the heart of this story, there's actually an immigration story of someone moving multiple times and having to restart their lives. And I found that every little thing in here really led up to Greta Lee's amazing performance in here. I thought she was incredible. GOTG is awesome in here as well. And John Magaro, who gives maybe one of my favorite monologues of the year. I'm trying not to say much about this film because I didn't go into it knowing much. I just heavily recommend if you love romances, you should go see this film. Now, my number 3, though, is John Wick Chapter 4, which is flat out one of the best action films of all time. This is a movie that I watched and I just went, yep, this is Keanu Reeves' big action masterpiece. And I've loved the John Wick franchise. I've loved each and every one of them. And for me, in a way, you could argue that the action got better and better and better in each one. But primarily what Chapter 4 does is it brings the best of both worlds. The best story in the John Wick franchise, as well as the best action set pieces. And I know they've kind of rumored and talked about that they might do a John Wick Chapter 5. I would absolutely hate that idea. I think that is stupid the way that this film ends, and primarily the final shot of John Wick in here just felt like the definitive thing that I absolutely needed. But the other thing that actually adds on top of this, other than the story and the action, is actually the characters that we see John Wick kind of interact with in here. Primarily when we look at Donnie Yen's Kane, who I think is a great antithesis to who John Wick is, and Donnie Yen is one of a kind in here. He deserves every spinoff after this movie, and I actually hope that the Western audiences now kind of appreciate him a bit more in films out here. I've loved everything he's ever done in his career, so it's kind of cool to see how much of a standout he was in John Wick Chapter 4 to so many other people who have probably never really seen him in a lot besides like Rogue One and other things in America. But it's more than just him, and I felt that every single side character in here really had something to do and meaningfully blew the story up into that next proportion. This is a movie that fires on all cylinders, like I mentioned, and I think when you look at the cinematography, the direction, it's a film that makes your mind blown, and you're like, how did they pull this off and also feel like a short film? I have watched hour and 45-minute movies this year that felt longer than John Wick Chapter 4. This movie was everything I wanted it to be, and I was so happy with it. We get down to my number 2, and I will say that maybe this film is not as great as the last two that I talked about, but it is a 5 out of 5 because of what it meant for me. And that is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, for people who don't know, Guardians of the Galaxy has been my favorite MCU film, well, since it came out. Sometimes I've switched it around into my number 2 spot, but 99% of the time I've ever done a ranking, Guardians of the Galaxy was my number 1. And it's, for me, the most rewatchable MCU film. I love these characters. I love everything about them. I love diving into them. I love just hanging out with them. And then 2 came out, and I like 2. I didn't love it, but I liked 2. And I love seeing them in Endgame and Infinity War and everything of that nature. And Rocket Raccoon has been one of my favorite MCU characters. I will argue after this film, he is the best written MCU character. And then 3 came out. And before watching 3, I went back and did a whole marathon. And I really understood 2 that time around. And I really came to love it. But what 3 does is you don't just love this movie for what it is. And the fact that it is Rocket's story But the fact that every character got something to do in that movie, Drax, Nebula, Mantis, Star-Lord, Groot was probably the one pushed back the most, but everyone got something to do something, whether it's in the action or story or both. This film enhanced the rest of those films. Very rare where a third film in a trilogy will make you re-look at the first and second movie and be like, oh my god, that sequence ties into this. Oh my god, this ties into this, and it enhances everything. It makes this, for me, the best comic book movie trilogy of all time. As of right now. Something's about to change for that, I think, but it was everything that I could have wanted. And as someone who did grow up with the Guardians of the Galaxy comic books, and I liked them, but then I primarily loved when they jumped into like the Star-Lord stuff and the Gamora and the Drax and the Rocket and the Groot, and you know, obviously that is the main team now in all the comics. I fell in love with it, and I fell in love with what James Gunn had done within this movie and what he did with these characters. The visual effects are out of this world. I actually love the story that they are telling here. The action scene in here, the one-shot take, is probably one of my favorite things that the MCU has ever done. But this felt like a core finale for what the MCU wanted it to be. And then this feels like a movie that should have came out a little bit closer after Endgame. But I think the fact that we've gotten to sit and wait to see these characters again in this type of capacity is actually one of the most important things, because it felt like these characters have bonded and grown with each other for so many years. And us as fans have kind of felt that same thing now. And I was an emotional wreck leaving this movie. And I think the dog days are over sequence at the very end that ends this entire movie is the perfect melody to view where all this is. And to say a giant goodbye to a majority of these characters. And I think at this point, I feel satisfied with where every character was left off at. And I never really thought I would say that. But I'm getting goosebumps right now, talking about how much I loved Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And why I think it is the perfect film to end this trilogy. As well as one of the best. I'm talking top 3 MCU films of all time. I fucking love Guardians of the Galaxy so much. And I really felt that this was James Gunn's best thing that he could have ever created. And again, there's nitpicks I think to have in the film, but a lot of those disappeared once I rewatched it like on my 4th time, and I was just like, I love this film so much. My number 1, if you just saw my review for this, you probably expected this, but it is Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse, which I said is one of the best films that I've ever watched in my entire life. As well as I've said, I've been reviewing movies on YouTube, like if we're talking professionally, probably for 5 years. If we're just talking in general doing YouTube, it's about 6-7 years. Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse is the best thing that I've ever talked about on my channel, bar none. This is a movie that if I would have seen as a kid, this would be my favorite film of all time. Like, my mind would have been blown. I cannot wait to have kids and show them this movie, because the fact that, yes, it's a comic book movie, and yes, it's a Spider-Man movie, and Spider-Man's my favorite superhero of all time, and I love Miles Morales, and I love Peter Parker, and I love all the other variants in here, specifically Gwen, who gets a great story arc throughout here, and really much the film opens and ends with her. And Miles' story which is wrapped into this anomaly of what is going on within the Spider-Verse. And I really loved how they were able to handle this. And this film, for people who don't know also, Into the Spider-Verse was my favorite comic book film before I saw this freaking thing. I found that Across the Spider-Verse was better in every sort of department, whether it was from the action, the animation, the story itself, which is, of course, a middle point story. And I know a lot of people didn't really love the to be continued part. I love that we got a giant cliffhanger in there. I felt satisfied and wanting more by the end of this film in the dire stakes of where we are at. But what else makes this film special is everything that goes into it. You have an incredible story being told here. And the fact that the first film is so amazing, the second film's even better, if the third film is even close. I mean, just as good as the first one, or even better than the second one, or just as good as the second one. This will be, personally, the best trilogy in my eyes that has ever been created. And I say that in live action, animation, whatever it is, this will be it. This movie is everything that I could have needed it to be. And I love that it really touches into Miles and the feelings of what is he doing wrong as Spider-Man. And the way that 2099 calls him a mistake at points throughout this movie. But Miles is doing it on his own. He's figuring it out. And I think what this movie does is it just contains the greatest mix of action set pieces, which of course we get tied in with Daniel Pepperman's score, which I've been listening to on repeat. But it's also every sequence just looks like a piece of artwork. Every character moves and feels to different animation. Like, look at Spider-Punk specifically, like 3 to 4 years on him and his design alone. And the small little subtle things and the way that they explain the multiverse and the way that they explain the canon events and the way that this is also a celebration of Spider-Man and everything within the Spider-Verse. But primarily what it actually is just one story, and it's a coming-of-age story of becoming into your own. While the first film was really much the start of that, this is the start of the second one, which shows all the parallels of what Miles has learned to stop the potential death of his father. And how does that work? How does that go? This is everything I needed this movie to be more. I was totally blown away by it and more. And it's, again, it's one of my favorite films of all time now. And it's one of the best movies I've seen in a long time. And it's the best film that I've reviewed on my channel. I'm so happy with that review, and I'm also just I love that movie so much. That's my top 10 so far for the whole entire year of 2023. Let me know down below what your guys' thoughts are. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more. If you want to see every film I've watched this year, you can definitely go check out my Letterboxd. I have kind of much a generic ranking on there, but my top 10 is pretty definitive on there. And there's a lot of great movies coming out later this year, so make sure to look forward to that next list I'm going to do, where I'm going to talk about my most anticipated for the rest of the year. And of course, until next time, stay classy.